Imagine a world where the most painful memories are locked away, not by anyone else, but by your own choice. Could you survive if you had the power to forget? Mark Scout, a man forced to split his memories, does exactly that in his fight against grief. But why would anyone choose such a drastic measure? Why would someone voluntarily shatter their own past, the very thing that shapes their identity, all in the name of survival? The answer is far from simple, and it lies deep within the psychology of grief, trauma, and the desperate need to protect oneself from overwhelming pain. Grief is an invisible force, one that can weigh down even the strongest of us. For Mark, it's not just the pain of loss he's struggling with. It's the constant echo of memories that refuse to fade. These memories, once cherished, have become suffocating reminders of what he's lost. The memories haunt him like ghosts, each one a painful reminder of the person he was before everything changed. To cope, Mark makes an unimaginable decision. He chooses to divide his memories. It's not just about forgetting, it's about survival. By compartmentalizing his past, he believes he can shield himself from the unbearable sorrow that threatens to consume him. In a sense, it's a defense mechanism, a way to take control of a life that feels uncontrollable. But what happens when you sever the ties to your past? What is left when the memories that once defined you are scattered and fragmented? Mark's choice is an attempt to escape his grief, but it also brings him closer to an emotional collapse. His struggle is not just with the loss itself. It's with the very act of erasing the past. By doing so, he risks losing the essence of who he is, the very core of his being. The more he separates himself from his memories, the more disconnected he becomes from his true self. The pain of grief, once locked away, only grows more intense. He finds himself unable to move forward, trapped in an endless cycle of avoidance. But in the silence of his fractured mind, there is no relief. His defense mechanism, meant to protect him, becomes the very thing that holds him back. This inner conflict is the heart of Mark's story. The more he tries to protect himself, the more he loses. His memories may be divided, but his pain is whole, relentless, and growing. It begs the question, can we truly escape our past, or does it always catch up with us, no matter how hard we try to forget? Mark's decision to split his memories is not just an act of self-preservation. It is a desperate attempt to regain control over his own identity. Grief, as profound as it is, has a way of stripping away the very core of a person. For Mark, every memory of his past is a link to a painful truth, one that he cannot escape. The memories of the ones he has lost and the life he used to have become chains, pulling him into an abyss of sorrow. The deeper Mark delves into this internal conflict, the more his sense of self begins to unravel. In his effort to avoid facing the pain of loss, he attempts to sever the emotional connection to his past. But in doing so, he faces a terrifying realization. What remains of him if he lets go of everything that once defined who he was? Each memory, though painful, is also a piece of the puzzle that forms his identity. By choosing to isolate these memories, Mark risks losing the very thing that anchors him to reality. His mind, in its attempt to protect him, is breaking down. It's as if he's trying to erase the parts of himself that remind him of his vulnerability, the parts that expose his deepest wounds. However, the more he tries to hide from his past, the more disconnected he feels from the present. This internal battle is tearing him apart. Mark finds himself in a vicious cycle. The more he isolates himself from his grief, the more he feels the emptiness that comes with losing touch with who he truly is. This is the paradox of his situation. Mark's defense mechanism, splitting his memories, is meant to shield him, but it only deepens his loneliness and sense of alienation. His attempt to escape the emotional weight of his grief has made him an outsider in his own life. He cannot move forward because, in trying to erase the past, he has left himself without a foundation. What was once a survival tactic becomes a prison of his own making. Mark's journey is not just about loss, but about the terrifying consequences of disconnecting from one's own truth. Each memory he tries to push away is a part of the map that leads him back to himself. In trying to escape, he inadvertently creates a void within, one that cannot be filled by simply avoiding the pain. His grief is still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting to be confronted. The more Mark tries to compartmentalize his past, the more he realizes that the very thing he is trying to escape is the thing he must face. His struggle is not with the memories themselves, but with the fear of confronting the pain they represent. In his attempt to survive, Mark learns that sometimes, avoiding the past can be more damaging than facing it. He is left with a haunting question. Can he ever heal if he refuses to acknowledge the memories that made him who he is? Mark's inner conflict stems from a deep, unresolved need for connection and validation, a need that has been neglected throughout his life. He is not just battling grief, but the lack of emotional nourishment that comes from feeling understood and loved. Mark's past, filled with broken relationships and painful memories, has left him with a void he doesn't know how to fill. This void is the source of his internal tension, where his desire for connection clashes with the fear of being vulnerable. He is caught in a paradox, desperately wanting to reach out to others, yet terrified of the potential for further rejection and emotional pain. His defense mechanism, the splitting of memories, is an attempt to avoid facing this core need. By detaching from the past, he tries to shield himself from the feelings of abandonment that have haunted him for years. Yet, this very act of detachment only makes the emptiness inside him grow more pronounced. Mark's need for love, understanding, and acceptance remains unmet, and this fuels his emotional turmoil. He wants to be seen, to matter to someone, but he feels invisible, as though his existence is meaningless in the eyes of those around him. His past attempts at connection have been met with disappointment, and as a result, he has built walls around himself. These walls, meant to protect him, have isolated him even further. As Mark navigates through this emotional maze, he realizes that his desire to shut off the painful memories is tied to his deeper need for belonging. He longs to feel a sense of worth, to have someone who can look past his flaws and see him as he truly is. But his fear of vulnerability keeps him trapped in a cycle of isolation. The more he tries to push others away, the more he yearns for their presence. This internal contradiction is what drives Mark to further fragment his memories, hoping to escape the pain that connects him to his past and, by extension, his need for human connection. However, this only intensifies his emotional distress. As he divides his memories, he also divides himself, creating a rift between who he was and who he is now. The person he is becoming feels disconnected, almost like a stranger to himself. Mark's unresolved need for love and validation, combined with his intense fear of rejection, keeps him stuck in a loop. He wants to heal, but the very act of protecting himself from the past is preventing him from facing the truth about his needs. His grief is not just about loss. It's about the unmet desires that have accumulated over time, the emotional needs that were never fulfilled. Mark cannot heal until he confronts these unmet needs, but doing so requires him to let go of his fear of vulnerability. Until then, he will continue to struggle with the tension between his desire for connection and his need to protect himself from the hurt that comes with it. Mark had been living in a state of numbness, constantly splitting his memories in an attempt to shield himself from his grief. His emotional walls were high, keeping everyone at a distance, including himself. He had convinced himself that forgetting was the key to survival, that if he erased the pain, he could somehow move forward. But one particular moment, seemingly insignificant, triggered a shift in his mind, the beginning of a psychological breakdown. It was a memory, one that he thought he had safely locked away. In an unexpected moment of vulnerability, Mark encountered a familiar face, someone from his past, someone who had once been his connection to happiness. The sight of this person, seemingly unaffected by time, brought everything flooding back. The love he once had, the laughter they shared, the moments of peace that now felt like distant dreams. The trigger wasn't just the person. It was the overwhelming realization that he had lost something so precious, something he could never get back. This moment shattered the fragile defenses Mark had built around himself. For the first time in years, he was forced to face the grief he had been running from. The memory that had once been a source of comfort now felt like a source of pain, a constant reminder of everything he had tried to forget. The trigger exposed the depth of Mark's internal struggle. He had been so focused on protecting himself from the past that he had forgotten the importance of truly experiencing life. His mind, once fragmented, began to feel the weight of the memories he had been avoiding. The emotional numbness he had relied on for so long was no longer enough to keep the floodgates closed. This pivotal moment sparked a chain reaction in Mark's psyche. The defense mechanism he had relied on for survival began to break down. He could no longer ignore the truth. In his attempt to escape the pain, he had denied himself the ability to heal. The confrontation with this trigger forced Mark to acknowledge that no amount of memory splitting could protect him from the reality of his emotions. He had spent so long running from the past that he had forgotten how to truly live in the present. The trigger wasn't just a reminder of his grief, it was a wake-up call. Mark had been hiding, but now he had to face what he had been avoiding. In this moment, Mark realized that the only way to move forward was not by running from his memories, but by confronting them head-on. The trigger forced him to reconsider everything he had believed about survival and healing. It was a turning point, one that would challenge his understanding of who he was and who he could become. This moment marked the beginning of a journey where Mark would have to confront the past, not to relive it, but to heal from it. Mark felt the weight of his choices settling in as the days passed. The once solid walls he had built around his emotions began to crumble, and he could feel the cracks forming in his carefully constructed defenses. He had spent so long pushing his memories away, believing that forgetting was the key to survival. But now, the trigger had set off a chain reaction, and he could no longer deny the truth he had been avoiding for so long. His mind, once fragmented and numb, was now overwhelmed by the flood of emotions he had tried to suppress. Grief, anger, and a sense of deep loss began to seep through the cracks, threatening to consume him. Mark realized that in his attempt to protect himself from the pain, he had inadvertently trapped himself in a state of emotional paralysis. The memories he had split away had become a part of him, lurking in the background, waiting for the moment when he would be forced to confront them. This moment had arrived. The transformation Mark underwent was not immediate, but it was undeniable. The gradual breakdown of his defenses revealed a man who had been living in denial, trying to outrun his own emotions. He had believed that by shutting off his past, he could protect his future, but now he understood the truth. The past was never gone. It was always there, hiding beneath the surface, waiting to resurface. The more Mark tried to suppress his grief, the more it grew, swelling within him like a tidal wave. His emotions were no longer something he could control, and the facade of strength he had built for himself began to crack. He had thought that splitting his memories would give him peace, but it only created a void within him. The more he tried to ignore it, the louder the emptiness became. He began to see that his attempt to avoid pain had only led him to a deeper kind of suffering. The transformation was painful, but necessary. Mark realized that he had to face his past, not to relive it, but to accept it. The process of healing required him to confront the very memories he had been trying to erase. The fear of vulnerability that had kept him locked in a cycle of isolation began to lose its grip. Slowly, he started to let go of the need to protect himself from his emotions. The breakdown of his defenses was not a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength. Mark was finally allowing himself to feel, to mourn, and to heal. It was a difficult process, and the path ahead was uncertain, but he was no longer running from his pain. He had finally reached the point where he could begin to put the pieces of his broken self back together. The transformation was not complete, but for the first time in a long time, Mark felt a glimmer of hope. He could see the possibility of a future where he could live with his memories, not as burdens, but as part of who he was. The long-term psychological consequences of Mark's actions began to reveal themselves as he navigated the aftermath of his decision to split his memories. While his attempt to protect himself from grief and emotional turmoil had initially provided a sense of temporary relief, the impact of this choice became more apparent over time. Mark's mind, once fragmented, was now a puzzle of missing pieces, and the longer he stayed in this state, the more disconnected he became from reality. His inability to fully process his emotions left him stuck in a perpetual cycle of avoidance, and this emotional numbness, which he had once seen as a shield, was now slowly suffocating him. Mark's sense of identity, once clearly defined, had become increasingly blurred. The more he separated himself from his memories, the less he understood who he truly was. His past, which he had tried to bury, had become an essential part of his self-understanding, and by rejecting it, He was rejecting the very foundation of his being. This fragmentation led to a deep internal conflict. Mark no longer felt like the person he once was. He found himself unable to connect with others in meaningful ways because he could not fully understand or accept his own experiences. His relationships, both with others and with himself, began to erode. The emotional void he had tried to escape from had expanded, and he felt more isolated than ever before. Mark's coping mechanism, which was once designed to protect him, had become a source of further pain. His fear of confronting his grief had led him to deny not only his past, but also the potential for healing. His inability to process his emotions fully meant that the wounds of his past continued to fester, preventing him from moving forward. The psychological toll of living in this state of denial was profound. Mark's inability to integrate his memories into his sense of self prevented him from experiencing true emotional growth. He had become trapped in an endless loop of avoidance, where every attempt to heal was met with a new layer of resistance. This resistance, however, was not external. It came from within him. Mark had built walls around his heart, and the longer he kept them up, the more difficult it became to tear them down. Over time, this emotional stagnation took its toll on his mental health. Mark began to feel a deep sense of despair, as though he were losing touch with the world around him. His once vibrant connections to others now felt distant and hollow. The psychological consequences of his decision to split his memories were not just about the pain of the past. They were about the inability to heal. The longer he lived in denial, the more detached he became from the possibility of healing, from the chance to rebuild his life. Mark's journey, once one of self-protection, had turned into one of self-destruction. He could not escape the past, no matter how hard he tried, and in doing so, he had isolated himself from any hope of redemption. Mark's journey through grief and emotional turmoil resonates deeply with the universal feelings of abandonment, loneliness, and being misunderstood. The more he isolates himself from his past, the more he experiences the haunting silence of solitude. In his attempt to protect himself from the overwhelming pain of loss, Mark has unknowingly distanced himself from the very people who could help him heal. This feeling of abandonment is not just about being left by others. It is also about the internal abandonment Mark feels toward himself. He has rejected his own memories, his own past, and by doing so, he feels like a stranger in his own life. There is a profound loneliness that comes from not being able to connect with those around you, or even with yourself. Mark's decision to split his memories was a desperate attempt to escape the weight of his emotions, but it led him to an even deeper sense of isolation. The pain of losing loved ones was something he couldn't bear to face, and so he chose to bury it. But in doing so, he not only lost the people who were once important to him, but also lost the ability to connect with anyone else. This is a feeling that many can relate to. When grief overwhelms us, we sometimes push others away, believing that we are better off alone. Mark feels misunderstood, like no one can truly grasp the depth of his pain. The more he withdraws into his own world, the more misunderstood he becomes, and the more he struggles to find a way out of his emotional maze. His desire to protect himself from further pain has left him feeling invisible to the world. It is as though he is standing on the sidelines of his own life, watching others move forward while he remains stuck in the past. The emotional walls he has built around himself only serve to reinforce the belief that no one truly understands him. This sense of being misunderstood is suffocating. Mark's emotional journey, full of grief, fear, and loneliness, reflects the deep need for connection that so many of us feel. Whether it is the pain of losing a loved one or the fear of rejection, the feeling of being misunderstood can make us feel as though we are alone in the world. Mark's struggle is not just about the events that have occurred, but about the deep emotional rift he feels inside himself. He is trying to reconcile who he was with who he has become, but the gap is vast, and the more he struggles, the more he feels lost. This emotional journey is something that can resonate with anyone who has ever felt alone in their pain, unable to reach out to those around them. The feelings of abandonment and loneliness Mark experiences are universal. They remind us that, in our darkest moments, we are not alone in our struggles, even if it feels like no one truly understands. Mark had spent so much of his life avoiding the pain of loss, believing that by hiding from it, he could find peace. But the truth was, his decision to distance himself from his memories only deepened his sense of abandonment. He couldn't escape the feeling that he had been left behind, not just by others, but by himself as well. The memories he tried so desperately to avoid had become his silent tormentors, a constant reminder of everything he had lost. Mark's emotional isolation became the very thing that held him captive. The loneliness he had tried to outrun grew louder with each passing day, making him feel as though he was trapped in a world that he could no longer relate to. He was no longer the person he once was, and the more he tried to shut out his past, the more disconnected he became from his true self. The fear of being misunderstood weighed heavily on Mark's heart. He had built emotional walls around himself, not only to protect himself from others, but also from his own emotions. The more he shut himself off from the world, the more he struggled to find his place in it. He yearned for understanding, for someone to see him as he truly was, yet he felt as though he was invisible. His inner conflict had become a constant companion, and it was exhausting. Mark's longing for connection became more intense as he sank deeper into his isolation. It wasn't just about the people he had lost. It was about the emotional distance he had put between himself and the world around him. He had abandoned himself in an effort to avoid the pain, but now he was left with nothing but the emptiness of that decision. His need for love and validation was unmet, and it haunted him like a ghost. The more he withdrew, the more he yearned for the very connection he was too afraid to reach for. This cycle of abandonment and loneliness only grew more profound as time went on. Mark's emotional journey was not just about grief. It was about the fear of being vulnerable and the inability to face the pain that came with it. His feelings of being misunderstood grew stronger with each day, as he convinced himself that no one could truly understand the depth of his struggle. He felt trapped in his own mind, unable to escape the overwhelming weight of his emotions. The desire for connection, though strong, was overshadowed by the fear of rejection, and Mark was left in a constant state of inner turmoil. His battle was not just with the people around him, but with himself. He had abandoned his own need for healing, for peace, and now he was left trying to find a way back to himself. This emotional conflict, rooted in abandonment, loneliness, and being misunderstood, was something that many people could relate to. It's easy to feel alone in our pain, to believe that no one can truly understand the struggles we face. But Mark's journey serves as a reminder that sometimes the most difficult battle is the one we fight within ourselves. Mark's journey through the complexities of emotional healing became a delicate balancing act between confronting his past and fearing the future. He had spent so long avoiding the pain of his memories that when faced with the truth, it felt almost too much to bear. The emotional numbness he had relied on as a defense mechanism began to fade, but with it came an overwhelming flood of emotions that he had spent years suppressing. He began to question everything about himself, the person he had become, the choices he had made, and the isolation he had chosen over connection. This journey was not just about grief. It was about the deep fear of vulnerability, the kind of fear that stops us from reaching out to others or from truly allowing ourselves to heal. Mark's internal struggle became a reflection of something many of us experience, the fear of truly being seen. When we hide from the pain, we also hide from the possibility of healing. Mark's emotional conflict was rooted in a universal truth. Our need for connection is fundamental to our well-being. The more he tried to distance himself from his grief, the more he realized that the very thing he had been avoiding was the thing that would set him free. His pain was not a weakness. It was part of being human. It was when Mark allowed himself to face that pain that he began to understand that healing requires more than just avoiding the past. It requires embracing the emotions that make us feel vulnerable, even if it means facing the fear of being rejected or misunderstood. Mark's fear of abandonment had shaped so much of his life. He believed that if he allowed himself to care for others or to be cared for, he would inevitably be let down. But what he discovered was that, in avoiding relationships, he had only abandoned himself. The loneliness that he had tried to escape from had become the very thing that kept him stuck. In learning to open himself up to the pain, Mark also began to open himself up to the possibility of connection. He realized that by allowing others in, he could rebuild what had been lost. It was not an easy journey, and there were many moments where he felt unsure, But Mark's willingness to face his grief and his fear of vulnerability marked a turning point in his healing process. For the first time in a long time, he could see the possibility of moving forward. Mark understood that healing was not about erasing the past or running from the pain. It was about accepting that part of himself and allowing it to guide him toward a healthier, more connected future. His story, filled with abandonment, loneliness, and the fear of being misunderstood, is a reminder that sometimes the hardest part of healing is allowing ourselves to be seen and heard.